If you don't give a shit about eating healthy, this isn't for you. But if you do, then hopefully by the end of this video, you'll understand what to look for in a healthy diet. My name is Anike Bharadwaj, and there are two main types of nutrients you need to consider when trying to eat healthy: macronutrients and micronutrients. So macros are what most people today who try to eat healthy obsess over: carbs, proteins, fats. They assume that that's the end all be all of eating healthy. However, many people under prioritize micronutrients, and that is a huge misconception about nutrition today. For example, magnesium is one nutrient that about 48% of Americans are deficient in, and although micronutrients are consumed in smaller quantities, you consume micros in milligrams or micrograms versus macros are in grams. Micronutrients should not be discounted in terms of importance. I personally didn't prioritize micronutrients for a long time, but as soon as I did, I started experiencing less brain fog, higher quality of life, and overall just better well being. So let's start with macronutrients, or macros for short. Three main types of macronutrients are carbs, proteins, and fats. So carbohydrates are your body's primary source of short-term energy, and it is 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. Now, one misconception that I see people think about carbohydrates is that if you eat carbs, you're going to get fat. And that's not the case. What really drives gaining fat is calories in versus calories out, which, if you don't know what that is, if you eat more calories than your body burns per day, then you will gain weight, regardless of whether those calories come from carbohydrates, proteins, or fats. So that's why I'm not a big proponent of the ketogenic diet, because I feel like that just takes away from your body's ability to use carbohydrates for energy. So you're just depleted and going to be replacing those calories with fats and proteins most likely anyway. So from a fat loss perspective, it can help if you're used to eating less protein and ketogenic forces you towards more protein, but you do not need to cut out carbohydrates to lose weight. Now, there are such things as slow versus fast digesting carbohydrates. Slow digesting carbohydrates are things like potatoes, oats. These items have more starch in them, especially potatoes. That makes it harder for your body to digest. Therefore, potatoes and oats are going to keep you fuller for longer, and in other words, more satiated. Potatoes are actually one of the most satiating foods you can eat. So if you are struggling with losing weight and feeling hungry throughout the day, swapping potatoes for things like rice is a great way that I found to be helpful. Now, on the other hand, we have fast digesting carbohydrates. These are things like fruit, honey, maple syrup, rice, and these do have a place, though they do not increase satiety as much as slow digesting carbohydrates. If you do work out, you do physical activity like go to the gym, go for runs, sports, etc., fast digesting carbohydrates are great for giving you energy right before you need it. So if you do consume carbohydrates about 30 to 60 minutes before your workout, and those are primarily fast digesting carbohydrates, then you're probably going to experience a boost in energy and therefore better performance in your lifts, runs, etc. Now, the window of consuming carbohydrates does change depending on how many carbohydrates or how many grams of carbohydrates you consume. But rule of thumb, 30 to 60 minutes is probably good, assuming you're consuming about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates. All of that is arbitrary, though. Do your own research to fit your needs. Now, some of my favorite sources of carbohydrates are potatoes, like I mentioned. Sweet potatoes, especially, are super nutrient dense, and we'll get into some of those micronutrients later. But I personally swapped out potatoes for rice and have seen a greater amount of satiety throughout my day, and that forces me to eat less. It's very hard to overeat on potatoes versus rice. Not to say rice is a bad carbohydrate. You can definitely incorporate it in your diet if that's something you enjoy. But if you struggle with satiety or micronutrient intake, rice is relatively easy to digest and not very nutrient dense. So therefore, probably not the best option. Oats are also a great one. Slow digesting carbohydrates I like to have in the morning. Fruit, loaded with micronutrients, fast digesting carbohydrate, but definitely has its place, especially for me pre-workout. Honey, maple syrup, those types of things are also great carbohydrates. Now, proteins are what you see gym bros obsess over because they help build muscle, but they also have a variety of other functions, such as repairing tissue, dealing with hair, skin, nails, so many other functions than just hypertrophy. And I think that today, protein is a little overstated in terms of importance. And I'll get into that in a second, but it is also 4 calories per gram. So, going back to what I just mentioned about protein being overstated in terms of importance, you see a lot of restaurants and influencers out there push forth the high protein diet. And I am all for that because I think most people underconsume protein. And we talked about satiety a lot with carbohydrates. Proteins are also very satiating in general. So it's harder for you to overeat on proteins compared to things like fats, for example. Therefore, it's better to have more protein in your diet than be deficient, obviously. But there is a caveat that people who consume more protein than they need to are inherently taking away calories that could be allocated towards carbohydrates, for example, and therefore hindering their performance in the gym. What I mean by that is the general recommendation is 0.7 grams per pound of body weight for protein. If you go above that threshold, it's unlikely you're going to see much benefit from a hypertrophic standpoint. You're not going to build more muscle because you eat 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Now, if I was to consume 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight, then I would have a lot less calories allocated to carbohydrates, so I wouldn't have the energy needed to fuel my workouts. That will ultimately reduce performance. And if you are active, you should definitely be making sure keep your protein in a reasonable range so that you have calories to allocate for carbs. Now, another question I want to address is, does source matter? So there are multiple types of protein out there: whey, casein, soy. They're a collagen protein as well. And the answer is kind of. So whey protein is the most bioavailable, therefore the gold standard in terms of protein. Casein is a step below that, a little bit harder for your body to process. Then soy is sometimes usually incomplete, and collagen is known not to help with muscle building specifically, but all 4 of these protein sources are useful to incorporate in your diet. So the reason I said kind of is because you shouldn't be obsessing so much over the source of your protein rather than just hitting a reasonable amount of protein throughout your day. So if you do consume a supplement, for example, that is casein or collagen, don't obsess over those 10 grams, making your diet like a binary, like I hit all my protein goals or I didn't. It's a continuum. So just prioritize whole foods, prioritize a variety of protein sources, and you'll get the complete amino acid set that your body needs most likely. Incomplete protein and things like that is not something you really need to obsess over, but it does have its place to consider the source. Now, fats are your body's primary source of long-term energy, and they are the most calorically dense out of the 3 macronutrients. Fats are 9 calories per gram, so that means that they are roughly double the caloric density of proteins and carbohydrates. This leads me to addressing the misconception that if you eat whole foods, you will lose weight. Now, there is a reason to eat whole foods, obviously, because it's harder to overeat on whole foods compared to processed foods. And therefore, if you're somebody starting out in your fitness journey and you don't know what to do, eating whole foods is a great first step and it will get you a large number of benefits. But it is not the full story. If I am eating whole foods, but I prioritize things like nuts, oils, avocado, these are all fatty items that are inherently healthy for me, but they aren't going to give me that goal of weight loss because they're so calorically dense. So therefore, you still need to be measuring what you're eating and looking at how many calories you're consuming if your goal is weight loss. Whole foods are not going to be the complete solution. Now, there are 3 main types of fats to consider: saturated, unsaturated, and trans fats. So unsaturated is the best type of fat, probably going to be found in things like olive oil, and this is generally considered like a healthier fat to incorporate in your diet. Or saturated fats are going to be found in things like butter, so you want to limit that as best as possible, but you can definitely still incorporate some saturated fats. I consume butter with my eggs, for example, so don't be scared of them, just limit the quantity. Then trans fats are going to come from processed foods such as fried items and such. You definitely want to keep these to a minimum, but again, balance is key. So not to say that you can't have any trans fat in your diet. Some of my favorite sources of fats are nuts, olive oil, avocado oil, nut butters. Those are going to give you a variety of micronutrients that your body needs. They're tasty and they definitely fall under the healthy fat category. And a general recommendation is to go for 0.3 to 0.5 grams per pound of body weight in terms of fats. This is especially important to keep in mind if you are cutting or trying to lose weight. Do not go under that 0.3 grams per pound of body weight, or at least around that area, because you'll definitely start to see some negative effects in your hormones, in your well-being, etc. Fats are necessary, so although it might be easier for you to strip fats so that you lose weight faster, like I mentioned, fats are more calorically dense. It's important that you keep your fats at a reasonable level to maintain proper bodily function. Moving on to micronutrients, there are a lot of nutrients on this board, and there are many more that I didn't cover because these are probably the ones that you're most likely to be deficient in. And if you are new to micronutrients and understanding nutrition, at least start with some of these. Make sure you're hitting them well. So we'll start with the B vitamins. There are number of B vitamins, and some great ways to hit them are eggs, meat, whole grains, leafy greens. B12 is one specific B vitamin that you're going to struggle with if you are a vegetarian, so considering a B vitamin supplement is not a bad idea. However, if you're a vegetarian, eggs are a great way to get a lot of your B vitamins. Vegans might especially struggle. Meat is going to be a great way to get B vitamins, grains, leafy greens. All of these should help you hit your targets. Now, I talked about magnesium earlier, and this is a big one because the majority of America, or 50% almost of America, is deficient in magnesium. So if you are struggling to eat these types of foods, then I would highly recommend a magnesium supplement. There's not really much to consider. There are a few different types of magnesium supplements. Citrate, glycinate, threonate are great ones. I think it doesn't necessarily matter as much which type you go with, but just make sure that you're getting the accurate dosage of magnesium in your supplement. Just checking that nutrition label and making sure everything looks good is the best way to go. Now, iron is another big one. If you are a woman, you are going to need more iron, and brown women especially are extremely deficient in iron. So red meat is a great way to get iron. Then you also have leafy greens and beans. An important caveat to draw up here is the difference between heme and non-heme iron. So things like red meat are going to be primarily composed of heme iron, and that's going to be more bioavailable. Bioavailable means that your body is able to absorb the iron and actually use it better. So if two different sources have identical amounts of iron, but there's one that has heme and the other one has non-heme, your body is going to be able to use the heme iron more effectively. So therefore, you want to be prioritizing heme sources of iron. Now, if you are a vegetarian, it's going to be hard to do that. So one way you can boost iron absorption is by pairing it with vitamin C. And I'll talk about a little bit more about vitamin C soon, but vitamin C comes from things like maybe a little bit of lemon juice would help, fruit, etc. Going into vitamin D, primary source of getting that are fatty fish, eggs, and the sun. So fatty fish, salmon is a great way to get vitamin D. Eggs also are somewhat abundant in vitamin D. And then, of course, if you are in the sun, then you will get some vitamin D. However, it depends on your geography because not all places are going to be getting vitamin D as well. If you are in colder places especially, and during the winter, it's going to be harder to get vitamin D. It's not as simple as you go out in the sun. There are windows of time that actually increase your absorption of vitamin D. So, for example, me being in Texas, around afternoon time during the summer, I'm good to go. But other times throughout the day, such as in the evening and such, being outside isn't enough. All that is to say that vitamin D is one that I personally supplement as well, and I would recommend it to anybody who isn't outside often. Vitamin D3 plus K2 is a great way to supplement because K2 increases the absorption, I believe. So definitely a good way to go about it. Calcium is another big one, important for bone health, etc. And you get that primarily from dairy and leafy greens. Notice that leafy greens are here in a lot of different places because leafy greens are just ultimately a superfood. When your parents say eat your vegetables, eat your greens, they're right. It does actually help you out. But you need to make sure you're actually having an adequate quantity to absorb those benefits. So if you're having just like a handful of spinach that's uncooked, it's going to reduce down. It's not going to be very effective in hitting your micronutrients because just eyeballing it and saying like, okay, there's a little bit of greens there, it's probably not going to be very effective. Going over to potassium, this is important in maintaining a sodium-potassium ratio. If you haven't heard of what that is, general recommendation is to keep your sodium about half your intake of your potassium, and this allows fluids to be balanced properly in the body. If you want to go for more potassium, I would say that's not a bad idea as well because most of the time people's diets are quite high in sodium, so balancing it out with potassium is a good idea. And I'm sure that most people are familiar with bananas being a great source of potassium. Um, Avocados are actually more dense in potassium than bananas, so that might be helpful. Potatoes are also a great source of potassium. Sweet potatoes, I mentioned earlier, are a superfood when it comes to potassium, vitamin A, and satiety in general. So definitely look into that. Moving over to zinc, the primary source of zinc is going to be meat. So if you are a vegetarian, look into supplementing this. Males especially, zinc is highly important for testosterone. So definitely consider whether you might be deficient in zinc. Shellfish and seeds are also great ways to get zinc. Now moving on to vitamins A and C. There are other vitamins, like I mentioned, this isn't a comprehensive list. E, K, that type of things are important, but vitamin A and C are primarily going to come from colorful veggies and fruit and leafy greens again. You see leafy greens a lot because it's that important. Like I mentioned earlier, sweet potatoes are a great way to get vitamin A, one of my favorites. And vitamin C, going back to the iron topic, vitamin C is going to help with absorbing iron. Then finally, we have omega-3s, and omega-3s are going to primarily come from fatty fish. One thing that people don't account for is things like chia seeds will advertise that they're high in omega-3s. And the reason that you can't solely get your omega-3s from chia seeds, for example, is because this topic of absorption. We've been talking about that a lot, and it seems like a lot that certain nutrients you're actually eating but can't even use. Unfortunately, that's the harsh reality of things. So there are three types of omega-3s: ALA, EPA, and DHA. So ALA, it has to be converted into the other two forms for your body to actually use. So things like chia seeds and plant sources of omega-3s are going to be primarily ALA. Therefore, you can only absorb, I believe, a little less than 15% of that. So if you don't consume fatty fish, you might want to take a supplement and make sure that it is EPA and DHA form of omega-3s. If you're a vegetarian and don't want to take a fish oil supplement, there is such a thing as algae oil, and that does come in EPA and DHA so that you still can get your omega-3s. But all that is to say, don't assume that you can get your omega-3s from chia seeds and other types of plant sources because the absorption is going to be a lot more hindered. Now, do you need to worry about every single micronutrient every single day, making sure that everything is in check and you track everything every single day? No. But you do need to be mindful, because if you're going to go about your day saying, oh, I'm just going to eat what the average person eats and assume that I'm going to be healthy, that's just not going to be the case. You can't you can't do average things and expect above average outcomes. There's a reason that so many people are obese today. So many people are fighting heart disease and other issues. So if you don't want to be one of them, you definitely have to at least consider which one of these you might be deficient on in a long enough time rise. But in general, if you're eating a variety of foods, going back to the whole foods thing, making sure you're eating primarily whole foods, limit the amount of things you're eating when you go out, you should be good to go.